Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Razan Pereira. Negotiators from around the world began 2 weeks of talks on curbing climate change on Sunday, 3 years after sealing a landmark deal in Paris that set a goal of keeping global warming well below 2 degrees Celsius. Envoys from almost 200 nations gathered in Poland's southern city of Katowice a day earlier than originally planned for the UN meeting that's scheduled to run until December 14th. Ministers and some heads of government joined in on Monday. Host Poland will push for a joint declaration to ensure a just transition for fossil fuel industries like coal producers who are facing closures as part of efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The meeting received a boost over the weekend after 19 major economies at the G20 summit affirmed their commitment to the 2015 Paris Climate Accord. The only holdout was the United States, which announced under President Donald Trump that it is withdrawing from the Climate Pact. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze what's likely to happen at the climate change talks in Poland. Joining me on the program today are Dileep Sinha, former Special Secretary, International Environmental Diplomacy, Government of India; Professor C.K. Varshney, environmentalist; Nitin Desai, former Deputy Secretary General, United Nations Conference on Environment; and Srikant K. Panigrahi, DG, Carbon Minus India. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. So Desai, I'd like to begin the program with you. The meeting in Poland is the most critical, really, after the Paris Accord that was held a few years ago. What can we expect from the talks?
Basically, what they're going through is this whole process of giving a structure to the Paris Agreement. This always happens in a UN process. When we had the Kyoto Protocol, it took us nearly 5 years to work out the rules and the institutions required for implementing it. So right now they're going through a process of defining rules in 4 key areas. The first area is that of what the accounting standards for measuring what you have actually achieved. Now, that will not be such a big issue. There has been a gradual convergence of on this, and I don't expect big problems. The problems are with the remaining 3. The first one is called MRV, monitoring, review, and verification. This has always been a source of contention because of the fear of many countries that it will become intrusive into their domestic policies. And the other 2 areas are the institutional structures for technology and finance, the commitments made there. What I see right now happening is that the developed countries are keen on making rules on the first 2, but not at all keen on setting up any sort of rules on how the other 2 parts of technology and finance should be done. One more thing I would like to add here. Poland is not the best place to have this meeting. In the European Union, it is the one country which has been dragging its feet, has been sort of very pro-fossil fuel, pro-coal particularly, and with some assistance from Mr. Trump, they will probably try and avoid any statement which actually reflects what ought to be said, which is, since Paris, all the evidence suggests that things are getting worse.
Right, right.
So I think basically I would have liked to see this as something which will really not just reinforce Paris, but really push ahead faster than expected. I don't think that's going to happen.
Professor Varshney, the fact that these particular talks are happening in Katowice in Poland, how big an issue is that, do you think? Does it send out a wrong message, really?
Well, the point is that after Paris Agreement, we find that the climate change issue is not receiving the kind of push that it requires. But at the same time, the problem is becoming far, far greater. And I just give you one good example, that from 2015, we find that there was a little bit plateau in the global carbon emission. And now we find that 2017, it has increased by 2%. So the question is that how serious we are. We have made a lot of commitment, different countries have made. And it was agreed at that time that we are going to make these agreements or these commitments more aggressive. But I don't think that any government has come out with more aggressive commitment as yet. As I said that, and as been said by Mr. Desai, that this is a process. and it's rather a slow process to really finalize the rules. But then so many countries are there, so it is a time taking. And actually the climate change is on our head and descending very fast. And we have seen the kind of disaster that around the world in terms of the droughts, in terms of the surges, in terms of the forest fire. So I think by every day, the problem is becoming more acute and complex. And every thread, in every aspect and facet of the human society is getting affected in a very serious way. And now the October report, which says that what we thought is right and perhaps reasonable, that holding the temperature 2 degrees will be reasonably good, but now we find that perhaps that is not the case. So I think the revised calculation shows that it has to be 1.5, and even then it is not completely safe. The only question is that the implications and the impacts are going to be little less than what it is. So I think under this condition we find that this process is not going to really take us very far in terms of containing and holding the climate change. Climate change is moving very fast, and it is creating serious problem to those who are not responsible for it. And in fact, the people who are poor and living on marginal lands are going to suffer very seriously. In our own case, we find that the because of the climate change and because of the sea level rise, there is ingress. And I think a large portion of our coastal land is really being lost, both in terms of actual land area and also because of the ingress of the saline water. And therefore, the coastal agriculture is one of the seriously impacted. And as they move forward, move inwards, because they cannot do agriculture there, they cannot have drinking water. So this population is going to move inward, and that is going to create a very serious problem.
Absolutely. Ambassador Sinha, couple of questions. First, of course, why is the UN process, I beg your pardon, so slow? Something that the professor spoke about in his opening remarks. And also, what's going to be different about this meeting in Poland?
Well, the UN process has always been slow. You can't have over 190 countries sitting and negotiating, as happens in these climate change negotiations, and expect to come up with results. Most of these conferences go well into beyond the conference time, and then they're able to patch up a compromise, usually worked out by the host country, and then pressure is put upon other countries to accept it, except perhaps in Copenhagen, where it could not be accepted and there was no outcome there. In Poland, because of Poland's own weak commitment to the whole process, we'll probably be able to do the minor work that is being done right now in Poland. What's being done there is essentially to work out the logistics of implementing the Paris Agreement. But that's a bit like rearranging the deck and the tables on the deck of the Titanic, because the primary problem is not that the Paris Agreement is not being adequately implemented, but that the Paris Agreement itself is inadequate. And that has been brought out in the report of the IPCC that came out 2 months ago, 2 months ago, in which it said that you need drastic action, and it is still possible to take action if drastic action is taken, to limit climate change to 1.5. Otherwise, by all reckoning, even if Paris Agreement is implemented honestly, which is questionable, the temperature increase is going to be between 3 and 5% because the contributions don't add up. The math doesn't add up. So merely arranging the mechanism for the implementation of Paris Agreement is not going to solve the problem. We have to revisit the agreement itself and revisit the commitments, because the two major countries that are responsible for emissions today, the highest emitter is China, and the second highest is the United States. Now, the US is walking out of the Paris Agreement, and China, whose emissions are already twice that of the US, has set a peaking target of around 2030, which means for the next 12 years, it will continue to increase its emissions. I don't know to what level. Even its per capita emissions are touching the average emissions of the industrialized countries. So we are in a difficult situation.
Absolutely. We are in a difficult situation. That having been said, Dr. Panigrahi, do you believe that this is really a make or break moment for the world?
Yes. We are really in a juncture where we have huge challenges on climate action. There were a lot of research studies has been conducted, and in IPCC very recently the policy makers report, which was released on October 15th, as you know, that to keep the temperature well below 1.5 degree, it is very tough, and we are not following right actions accordingly. And if even if we act based on our NDCs, that is National Determined Contributions, that we have submitted in the Paris Agreement and it ultimately got approved. Even if you are strictly start working on that, by 2030, we will not able to achieve 1.5 degree centigrade. And which is it is doubtful whether we'll even all of us can work what we have committed. So in such a situations, it is remained as a most important challenge. There are 4 modeling which were undertaken. One is what needs to be done if temperature has to be kept below 1.5 degrees centigrade, at 1.5 degrees centigrade, between 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade, and well below, that is in and 2 degrees centigrade. And even if we are not going to do any action, it will double the temperature than 2 degree, and it will go 4 degree and plus. And if you are which is practically possible, the way we can work with resources available with us, with the kind of the international commitments in multilateral agreements on environment that has been executed, and the developed country and industrialist countries has what they have committed on technology transfer and finance kit. Taking all that in account, if everything went well, even if keeping the temperature below 2 degrees centigrade will be a huge challenge.
Absolutely.
So in such a situations, particularly for India, the challenges are manifold.
Absolutely. We'll come to India's challenges ahead in the program. I'd like to hear the others as well. But before that, Dr. Desai, how big a role is money going to play in Poland, do you think? Because the World Bank has announced $200 billion over the next 5 years as far as dealing with climate change is concerned. So how big a factor is that going to be?
Well, finance, climate finance is a major issue, but one of the areas which was highlighted in Paris, the problem is the developed countries are unwilling to treat it on the same footing as the other issues. See, the real problem is that I think we are reaching a point at which we cannot get an agreement if we are simply going to argue on the basis of protecting national interest. You will have to bring ethics into it. And the ethics of equity, 3 areas: culpability, capacity, and impact. Who is responsible for the problem? Who has the capacity to address it more than somebody else? And who is going to suffer the impact? On all 3 grounds, you can say that what we are moving towards is departing from that concept of equity. Second, within the country, also we must have the same sense of equity. That within the country also we are going to get a problem that the problem will, much of the emissions come from a small group of people. They have the capacity and the money to address the problem, but the impact is going to be felt mainly by the poor. So both amongst countries and within countries, and unless I think we find some way of bringing ethics in, I feel as an old former UN man, I think the time has come for the non-governmental actors to step in a big way. There are 2 examples. One was the Land Mines Treaty, which was basically promoted by non-governmental organizations who then got 1 or 2 governments to champion the cause in the formal process, and it got done. The second one was the debt relief, which was again launched by NGOs who created a momentum, and then a couple of governments were ready to take a leadership. I think we've reached a point at which we now need pressure from global public opinion. Without that, I don't think we're going to get anywhere.
Right.
And it may take some time to do this, but I believe we are reaching the limits of what we can get out of a process based on everybody trying to protect. You do this, I'm not going to do this till you do that, you see. If we work on that, it's not going to happen.
Absolutely. Professor?
And remember
So-
this,
Yeah.
that, we say 1.5 is what we should have. 2 is what people seem to be working towards. The reality is we are not even on target for 2.
2, yeah.
You know?
And that's
Why are
that-
you talking about 1.5?
Yeah.
You're not on target for 2.
Yeah, that's the most alarming aspect of all of this. Professor, so what should be the main focus really as far as these talks are concerned? Cutting carbon, do you believe is should top the agenda?
I think we have to really work very hard on this, because people are really taking this carbon and the climate issue as any other issue which is being discussed in United Nations. I do not understand that when you have a problem of existential type of a crisis, can we go with this kind of a leisurely attitude with which UN always takes the political issues? Political issues are much minor issues as compared to the global issue, for which whole humanity is involved. Not only whole humanity, the life itself is involved in a big way. And I think the symptoms are seen all over the place in every facet of the life. And if that is the attitude where the UN is not able to streamline the process, where we find that individual countries are working for their self-national interest, and where the developing countries are dragging their feet to meet their commitment, I find that the times that we are having are very challenging and very, very difficult. The question is that even 1.5 is not very safe. Even then we are going to have lots of impact, and no individual country is capable of really dealing with this problem. And in that scenario, we have to really focus and make a very strong case from the Indian side that how the India is suffering because of the problem that has been inflicted on the country and on the developing world as such. I think we have taken a lead in terms of really saying that we are going to have this solar alliance, but likewise we have to really further state that it is incumbent upon the developing countries to really see the consequences and share the new technology without really any hitches and without any safeguards which they are trying to make and so on. So I think the barrier-free flow of the new technology should be made available so that the global life as well as the people can be safeguarded. I tell you that the climate-induced migrations are going to be such a big problem that we find that we are going to be bogged down with a large number of these people without any means and without any resources wandering here and there. And that is the real worry. And that time is not very far. It is almost, we are on it and we are at the threshold. So I think the kind of problems that we are facing are very serious. You see the kind of influx of the refugees in Europe, what kind of problem it has created. In our own country, we find what kind of problem we are facing. And the worst part is that the climate-induced migrations are not being treated at par with other kind of a refugee problem. So
Absolutely.
I think that is another problem.
Sure.
So I think on many fronts, we have to really work and activate both United Nations as well as individual countries to meet to this challenge, which is a very complex nature.
Ambassador, you mentioned the United States in your opening remark. Will President Trump and the US feature at all at these talks?
Well, that will be as the proverb goes, the elephant in the room, because everybody is looking towards the US. The US has been the main upholder of the multilateral system so far. It is a major country, it has a lot of think tanks. And we must remember that the pressure for international negotiations and for a global agreement, the global public opinion was created essentially in Europe. And by some think tanks, not many in the US, essentially in Europe. And Europe today is beset with its own internal problems. You know what, the Brexit issue, the immigration issue. So that global pressure is now missing. The other is that the dynamic of the North-South, the developing versus developed, and the common but differential responsibility, that dynamic is over now with the Kyoto Protocol gone. So we can no longer think of international negotiations as negotiations between developing countries and developed countries or industrialized countries. Today, I think we'll have to turn towards ourselves and look at our own fate and say we are going to do it not for the sake of the rest of the world, but for our own sake. Because we ourselves are victims and we are now not major contributors, we are reasonably big contributors to global warming. But more than that, our own, now pollution is different from global warming, but pollution also contributes to it.
Yes.
But our major problem is pollution, and we have to address that problem because that's very serious in India. So it is more for our own sake that we must start doing this rather than worry about what happens in Warsaw and whether the US is walking out of the Paris Agreement. Those are very serious issues, yes.
Yes.
But there's very little we can do to influence that process.
So we should do what we can,
Yeah.
At the end of the day. All right. Dr. Panigrahi, talking about India now, what are India's concerns really, and what have we done to address the problem of climate change?
India, in fact, is doing a lot of things to address the climate change. If you see culture-wise, we are such a country that many things has been already there in our traditions that I need not to be elaborate. And particularly the government has always played a proactive role. If you see the history of climate change right from the Earth Summit 1992, where UNFCCC came to birth along with two other conventions, United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity and Combating Desertification. And if you see the recent INDC, that is Intended National Determined Contribution, which became the NDC after the approval in the Paris Agreement, India's NDC is the most ambitious and highly promising. Although we are fourth in the series in terms of total emission, European Union is the number 3, but many people argue that European Union is a union of countries. It is not a country itself, so India could be third. So even if you consider India's position in terms of total emission is after China and USA, but our commitments in NDC is more aggressive compared to these both countries in terms of total carbon intensity of GDP reduction, that is 33 to 35%. The second important commitment is 40% of our total energy mix or energy portfolio by 2030 will be from non-fossil fuel routes, 40%. And 2.5 to 3 billion tons of carbon sequestration is expected to be achieved through plantations drive and trees plantation and all that.
Right.
So these are there are many other ambitious commitments. No other countries has committed their commitments to this extent.
All right.
Coming to in terms of impact, India is likely to be one of the most affected countries in terms of total number of population, in total number of migrants, and total amount of properties, in terms of extreme events, and in terms of all other likely impacts, including food security in agricultural sector, which has been found out from research studies.
All right. So I think I'm going to take a cue from there and get closing comments from all my guests on the impact for India and really what's at stake as far as India is concerned, starting with you first, Dr. Desai.
Well, what's at stake is that my house is burning. And if my house is burning, it doesn't really make a lot of sense for me to stand by the side and say somebody else started the fire. Unless that guy does something, I won't do anything. Yeah. That was not a very sensible attitude to do when my own house is also burning. Yes, of course, I must complain about the person who's causing the fire. I must try and pressurize that person. But I must also recognize it's my house, it's burning, I'm going to be the sufferer. Let me start doing something about it. At the least, start on the adaptation side, on getting people to adapt to the changes which are going to take place in terms of coastal zone development, in terms of the way you manage water resources, in terms of the way you design your cities, etc., etc. So let's at least start doing something. And yes, keep up the pressure. Because these guys in the West are absolutely lacking in any sort of responsibility, because they're not going to feel the impact on the scale that we are going to be feeling. But we have to keep it up.
All right. Professor?
I think what has been said, I totally agree that it is time that we should augment our input into the research effect and create situations which are really having to save ourselves from the impending climate change. You see, our country has different climate as well as different soils and different landforms, and therefore any single solution is not going to help this country. What is required is that regionally we have to step up And now we know that every state has a climate cell, and these cells have to be activated so that they start doing some work in order to really see the local problems and to decide that what kind of adaptation has to be developed for agriculture, for coastal fisheries, and so on and so forth. The smart city concept that we are having has to really relook about the question of making it climate safe and how we can do it. And I do not see yet that the climate and the importance of the climate and the adaptation that is required to really face the climate change has not been mainstreamed into our planning and thinking and action. And
right.
This is what is needed, that at present whatever we do, including the Kidwai Nagar development or any other thing, we have to really work out a plan where the climate considerations and the likely impact and the way that we are going to face them becomes a central issue.
Right. Yes, Dr. Panigrahi, you wanted to add something.
Yes. The government has their work to do. The climate conferences will give us many guidelines. But the most important thing is at individual level, all of us must work. That is, we can lead a climate-friendly lifestyle. We need to be very cautious in terms of greenhouse gas emissions that we are causing through our activities. Let it be food consumption, let it be dress consumption, let it be any kind of lifestyle issues. The sustainable production and consumption, which is very much there in Gandhian thoughts and which is a part of the Indian tradition and culture, we should keep that in mind, and we should be very particular to lead a climate-friendly lifestyle.
All right. So the government is doing what it can, and the government will continue to do that. But it's also up to every individual really to take this matter seriously and do what best he or she can, is what the previous panelist is suggesting. Ambassador, close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
Well, I think I'll just say that we need to invest very heavily in eco-friendly technology, because that is essential for us for two important reasons. One is for poverty alleviation. We cannot lift our people out of poverty unless we have different technologies. Our current technologies, if we lift our masses out of poverty and start consuming the way the elite consumes today in the world, there will be no environment left in India at least. And the other is for our own energy security, because we are heavily dependent upon oil imports. And one crisis in the Middle East and we start shivering over here. So we have to invest in eco-friendly technologies for these two important reasons. That is for our own benefit.
And how far have we come as far as the technology is concerned?
Well, the experts will have to say that how far we are trying to progress in this, but I'm afraid I don't think our R&D investment is good enough at the present moment, and also the whole process of transferring technology from universities, the research centers to industry, that process still remains very, very difficult in India.
All right. On that note, then, I'll have to call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's it from me. See you again next time.